Good day. Welcome to another lesson on our Entrepreneurship Master Program. Today we're looking at case studies on corporate governance. But before we go into case studies, I'll give you a little background on corporate governance. And I've indicated before that we've completed the module on corporate governance, and the case studies are just to give you like a more practical experience or exposure to how other organizations are running their business when it comes to corporate governance. So what is corporate governance and why is it important for businesses? And remember, corporate governance, it is a big term because mainly it's designed for large institutions. Because I think it came after the scandals some time back from Enron and WorldCom when they failed, and Arthur Andersen. They failed because they were cooking their books and they were not transparent, they were not fair in how they accounted for some of the transactions, and different people didn't want to take responsibility and accountability for their actions during that disaster, where those businesses, they failed maybe within a year of each other. So, and then they realized that sometimes corporate executives can be reckless when it comes to governance. And remember, why would corporate executives be reckless? Because they have an objective to achieve, right? Most especially large institutions, the CEOs have targets to achieve. And if you're listed on the stock markets, the analysts are following your quarterly performance and all that. And if you don't perform according to your budget, then they will it will negatively affect your share price. And because the executives, they don't want the share price to drop because they didn't meet the targets, they start now doing funny things where they are cooking the books so that they can maintain that consistent growth, so that they can get their bonuses, because the bonuses of your CEOs are linked to the performance of the company. And if you're not performing, that means you're not going to get bonus. Okay, not only get the bonus, but you're going to get fired, because shareholders want a performing CEO. So now this, it's been happening, but when it happened with your Enron and WorldCom and Arthur Andersen, that story just made the corporate world to say, whoa, let's stop and relook at this. Then that's when the corporate governance principles were started to be introduced, started in the US, and then it filtered down to us. And in South Africa, the corporate governance principles were given to King Commission to look at how corporates can improve their governance, right? So that the disaster that we're seeing, where executives are getting away with murder in terms of the performance, where they are falsifying the documents, it doesn't happen. Remember, but with a corporate governance, it's just a guide. It's not necessarily a rule, or it's not necessarily a law. So it's a guide. Those are guiding principles for organization to follow. So with King, obviously, as I said, that the King report is mainly focused on the big corporates which have the board of directors. So the main focus, like maybe 70% of King recommendations are on the board of directors, right? And filtering down to the executive directors, but mainly it's on the board of directors. They need to have an independent chair. They need to have risk committees. They need to have internal audit committees. They need to have HR policy committees and all those things. So there are committees upon committees that, but the objectives of King Commission or King Report or corporate governance as in South Africa, it's more, if you're talking king, you're talking corporate governance. The main thing is to make sure that the businesses are governed the way they're supposed to be governed. There are directors and managers are taking responsibility. They're taking accountability. They are fair in how they're dealing with the shareholders, the stakeholders, and all that. And they know what they're supposed to be responsible for. But okay, not most important, I almost said most important, but the other one is that they need to do a proper risk management where they identify potential risks and then they need to come up with strategies to mitigate those risks. So identifying risk and all that is also critical for a business on its own, because with corporate governance, the objective is to reduce the risk of the business failing, right? That's key. Then, because you need to run your business in a open, transparent, accountable way so that it doesn't fail. And you must be responsible in a way that, like in South Africa, we know that we're coming from apartheid and where previously disadvantaged individuals were disadvantaged. So with responsibility, it comes, it linked more closely to your BE codes, where you need to make sure that you empower, there's black empowerment within the organization. Call it affirmative action, where you are pointing the right people in terms of color and all that, the mix, making sure that you have good women representative in your business dealings. And also the BE component, where you preferential procurement, where you are procuring from the previously disadvantaged, so that you can boost their participation in the economy. And then as well as donations and contribution to communities and all that. So that's on the responsibility side. So the corporate governance is not only looking at managing the risk that the organization can be exposed to, but it wants organization to be responsible by contributing towards the development of previously disadvantaged individuals like women, people with disability, rural areas and such things. And also from the risk, if anything happens, executives must be, and the board must be accountable, must be they must be accountable, and they must be transparent in how they deal with other stakeholders. Because as we learned from Welcome and Enron and I understand, there were a lot of secrecy from the executive in terms of how they dealt with the affairs of the business. But it didn't end there. I mean, we had a fair share of our corporate scandals. We had our A-bill, Ellerins and A-bill scandal, where executives were just reckless and the business ended up under curatorship or management from Reserve Bank. We had VBS, it was the mutual bank from Limpopo. It had its own governance issues. We had Steinhoff, which even government pension funds lost billions in that transaction. So they failed because of corporate governance issues, where management were making wrong decisions. They were not transparent on their transactions, and they were not dealing fairly with other stakeholders. So they were going against the principles of corporate governance. But that now, it sounds far-fetched in terms of appointing board of directors, making sure that the CEOs are accountable from the small and medium enterprises that our platform is focused on. So what I will do is, in terms of the case studies, is to bring it back to be relevant to the small businesses. Because these principles, certain principles might not apply, but I mean the principle of being responsible, doing good, it applies to a small business as well. Being fair, it also applies to small businesses. Yes, it might not be to shareholders, but to employees, for example, for the suppliers that we're dealing with. Being accountable, you need to be accountable. You might find that you are 2-3 shareholders in there. You need to be able to know that you are accountable to each other and you can trust each other. So we're bringing it, even though the design, the key recommendations and all that are mainly for big businesses that are also listed on JSE, but small businesses, they need to make sure that they have proper governance in place. We spoke about in the previous lesson on small businesses having proper systems in place, right? To complement the systems that needs to be in place, you need to have a governance structure in place where you know who's accountable for what, you know who's responsible for what, you know who's supposed to be managing your business risks. So as you manage your business risk, the best way to do it is under your corporate governance. It's very, very important. And we'll look at how the 3 case studies implemented the corporate governance. We'll start with AUI. AUI, as we've been explaining, these are a gentleman who started a tendering business. They were tendering for contracts at the Department of Defense in the USA. And they started small and they grew. As they grew, they started tendering for bigger and bigger projects until they landed the Afghanistan contract, and then they failed to deliver on that. But that one has got a lot of poor corporate governance. So with AUI, as I said, even when we're looking at the systems and procedures, to say that is even though it's a case study, but it's a case study of the things that you're not supposed to do, rather than a case study on the things that you're supposed to do. So we have AUI, and this case study is based on the movie War Dogs, which is about, it's based on true story. But the movie is called War Dogs, so you need to watch the movie to get the context of this discussion. And we're not going to analyze the whole movie. We only analyze the movie to the extent of corporate governance. All right, that's the first case study. And then the second case study will be on Macdonald's. We know Macdonald's is massive today, and we know that because it's listed, it needs to follow the proper corporate governance and those principles, and which it does, because recently I just looked at their financials. They take it serious, but they have to, because it's a multinational company which is listed on New York Stock Exchange. So it is forced by the requirements of their listing to comply with corporate governance principles. But we're not looking at the McDonald's. Okay, we'll touch on the McDonald's today, but we're looking at the McDonald's, the small growing McDonald's, so that SMMEs or people who are managing small businesses can relate to these corporate governance issues. And then we go into the third case study, which is the Oakland A's. The Oakland A's is a baseball team based in the US, and the case study is based on the book and the movie named the same, Moneyball. They are both called Moneyball. So here we're looking at the performance and how the corporate governance issues were dealt with in the Oakland A's. But with the Oakland A's, we have limited exposure on the corporate governance issues, because the movie is not focused on the actual governance, but it's focused on the maths and the innovation that Billy Bean brought to recruit players that differentiated the Oakland A's from other teams. So the movie is more focused on the system that Billy adopted, but we'll get scenes or areas where they touch on corporate governance, so that we can make it practical for you to understand how you can implement corporate governance in your business and how did it impact other businesses, so that you can have a better understanding of corporate governance. Now, I just wanted to paint the background before I go into detail on each case or each case study. Then next, I'm going into the case study. We'll start with AUI. Now we are looking at the corporate governance from the case study on AEY. Okay, I've explained who is AEY. So we have the background. You need to watch the movie or doc so that you get proper context. All right. So when it comes to AEY, we're looking at the principles that they have applied. And as I said earlier, AEY case study is on the things that you're not supposed to do when it comes to corporate governance. So corporate governance is just the overall management of the business, making sure that you comply with the basic compliance issues. You operate your business fairly, you are fair in your dealings, you are responsible, you do community projects and inputs, you are accountable as executives, and you manage your risks. So with AEY, their corporate governance was just non-existent. Why am I saying that? Okay, first maybe I'll start with their risk management. There were no risk management at all. AEY was the most, highest, they had the highest risk tolerance of any other business that I have ever seen. Like they were close to being criminals, if I can call it that, the way they ran the business. They took significant risk to make money. If there was money to be made, AEY will be there. And from the movie, to show how ignorant they were to risk. Remember when the Italians banned trade between them and Iraq, when they sanctioned the trade between them and Iraq. So AEY couldn't buy the guns that were required and deliver them in Iraq, because the guns were produced in Italy and they were supposed to be delivered to American soldiers in Iraq. So then what happened is the Italians banned trade or sanctioned the trade between the two countries. So they couldn't buy those guns and deliver them in Iraq. So what happened is they took a risk to say, we'll buy the guns from Italy, because the Italians were the only manufacturers of that type, that gun that they were looking for, that specific guns that they were looking for. So what AEY did, they said, no, even though they put sanctions, we'll buy these guns anyway, but we're going to lie to the Italians to say we are supplying them to Jordan. And then from Jordan, because Jordan is bordering, it's a border, they are separated by the border between, it's a neighboring country to Iraq. So they will fly them from Jordan to Iraq. That was their plan. But you can hear from this plan anyway, because with corporate governance, you must always be transparent and truthful. So by this action, they are breaking the first principle of transparency. Two, they're breaking the next one of being truthful, because if you are transparent, then it follows that you need to be truthful. So they broke that. But now, when their guns arrived in Jordan, then the authorities there, then they confiscated those guns. Then Ephraim and David, they went to Jordan and they bribed the officials there, or they met a person who had connections in government, and they bribed the person to the government of Jordan to release the guns. So now bribe, which is one of the principles that corporate governance is going against, is trying to make sure that you are honest, you are truthful in how you do things, you are responsible, you are accountable. So now them bribing that person to get the guns released from custody, it also goes against the principle of good corporate governance, because now you're committing a crime. So as entrepreneurs, you must not do things that will lead to committing crime. And in this case, AY committed a crime. So then they got their guns back. Now, they couldn't fly them to Iraq, but they have to deliver because the end user was threatening to cancel them for cost. So instead of flying them, they had to drive them. And driving them is the riskiest thing that you could have done because they had to drive through the triangle of death, as they call it, because it had high killings in that area that they had to pass. But because these are call it hustlers, they're deal makers, they wanted to deliver no matter the risk. So now with corporate governance, they say you need to identify risk and implement risk mitigation so that your business is sustainable. But with AEY, they didn't consider the risks involved. They didn't consider sustainability of the business because they drove the guns to Iraq. And remember, these are two senior individuals in the business. They are actually the management. The rest were just technical people. So if they were killed in the process, that means AEY would have died. And the corporate governance, it goes against to say you need to assess your risk to make sure that the things that you do, a business can still be sustainable. You need to have a reasonable risk tolerance. But the risk tolerance of these guys was just out of this world. So they drove the guns to Iraq, but lucky enough, they were not killed. But they could have killed and AEY would have failed because remember, they were the key executives of that organization. So now, this as well goes against the principles of corporate governance, right? And then that's on this transaction. And then on another transaction, the second one, which is the biggest one, and this one caused their downfall. What happened is, okay, they secured this contract, but how they secured the contract is they faked their financial records. Another action that is clearly against the corporate governance. They faked the financial records because they didn't have enough experience to convince the Pentagon to give them a $300 million contract. They didn't have financial controls in place. They didn't have financial records. So what they did is they faked the financial records. And this is one of the reasons why Enron and WellCom and Arthur Andersen failed. That's why VBS failed. It's because they were lying on their record. They falsified their record. Okay. So as an entrepreneur, you need to be careful on falsifying records because that will lead to failure. So there are many businesses that have failed because initially investors will think that the business is performing to only realize that actually the performance is fake because the records are falsified. And that's the reason why corporate governance was established, is to curb or to reduce such behavior. But you can see from AEY, anything that needed to be done, it will be done. It doesn't matter if it goes against the law. It doesn't matter if it's transparent. It doesn't matter if it's increasing the risk. They will do it. So there were corporate governance for them, it didn't exist because they were breaking each and every principle or all the principles within the corporate governance or the principles that are encouraged by corporate governance. And okay, faking the financial records, it didn't end there with this deal, the Afghanistan deal. Later on, they realized that they were buying the Chinese bullets. And again, they misled the Pentagon by repackaging the ammunition so that they can sell it without the branding from China. So now that's one that goes against the principle of fairness, of truthfulness, of transparency. Because they were not being fair to the US government. They were not being fair to the soldiers in Afghanistan because they were using the Chinese ammunition that was old. People might have being killed because the ammunition didn't work because it was old, and they were breaking the law because they were not supposed to supply the Afghanistans with ammunition from China. Goes against the corporate governance principles. Okay, that part as well, the repackaging part, it involved them hiring another person to repackage the bullets for them. And after that, they didn't pay the person that they have hired. Even that person, because the deal would have failed without finding a person to repackage those bullets. Then this person comes in, he saves the deal, he charges them, I think he charged them 100,000 US dollars. By repackaging, AY saved about 3 million rand. Imagine if you are saving, this guy is giving you a service that will make you save 300 million. No, it will make you save 3 million, and they're just looking for 100,000. Why would you not pay them? No, not AUI. AUI decided not to pay the box guy. And now that as well goes against the principle of corporate governance. You need to be fair when you're dealing with your stakeholders. They were not fair to this guy. And you need to be transparent. They didn't tell him that they're not going to pay him. They just decided not to pay him. And it was their downfall because he reported them, because he knew why they were repackaging the bullets. So he reported them to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon arrested them. So, and then Ephraim ended being in jail, and then David being on house arrest. So you can see the non-compliance of corporate governance. It will make you end up in prison. It's just that even with Enron, the CEO or the executives, I know one of them committed suicide, so I don't know which one, but they ended up in prison. Welcome, prison. I can understand certain people were in prison. Coming locally, VBS, okay, they're not in prison yet, but they are attending their court case. They're not convicted yet, but they're attending court cases. Okay, staying off, I'm not sure if anyone will go to prison there. But we know the crime has been committed by not following the corporate governance. You might end up in prison if you are not following corporate governance. We can see with AUI, practical example, Enron, Welcome, Arthur Andersen, staying off. Okay, staying off, they're not in prison, but someone must go to prison there. VBS, few people will go to prison. Because, I mean, they've lost quite few billions there. Staniov lost massively, lost, I think, more than 100 billion or something like that. That's massive. It's because they were not following the corporate governance. They disregarded the principles of corporate governance. Okay, so that's the case study on AUI. Then next we'll go into the Macdonald's case study. And now we are going into the Macdonald's case study. When it comes to corporate governance, right, we know now because McDonald's is listed. So the corporate governance, they have corporate governance in place because it's required by the institution that they listed with, like your New York Stock Exchange, because listed companies are, call it more or less forced to have corporate governance and to comply with corporate governance because it's one of those conditions of complying with the listing requirements. But what we're going to do now is just maybe to look back, take McDonald's back to the origin. So what happened is initially when Ray started, obviously the McDonald's brothers were running a two-man show. So then when Ray bought into McDonald's, so they created a partnership where Ray will start franchising the McDonald's brand. So it was governed by the relationship, the franchise relationship between Ray and the McDonald brothers. So now, based on corporate governance, contracts and transparency becomes very important to make sure that as a party to a contract, you need to comply with the requirements of the contract. It's one of those things that you need to always be transparent. You need to be fair in dealing with relationships and contracts. So what happened with the Macdonald's brothers, with the relationship between Ray? There were differences between the two, because Ray felt that the franchise agreement was a little bit unfair, and he wanted them to change the agreement, but the Macdonald's brothers were not willing to change it, and that's what caused the conflict between the two. So now Ray started doing things in not so transparent way, because the Macdonald's brothers were not cooperating with him. So in terms of that relationship, Ray started doing things like implementing the instant mix for their milkshake, while the Macdonald's brothers didn't want him to implement it. So because of that the trust was broken between the Macdonald's brothers and Ray, because he started doing things that he's not supposed to. So now, towards the end of their partnership, the relationship was no longer as good as it was from the beginning. Because, I mean, if you are in a contract with a party and the party is not adhering to the contract, then it becomes a problem. And you start losing trust. And if the party is not coming forth with information, informing you and complying with the contract, then that's straining the relationship between the two parties. So when it comes to Ray, the Macdonald's brothers, towards the end of the relationship, before Ray bought them out, the relationship was already strained. And Ray established the real estate arm using the Macdonald's brothers branding without their approval. So that's where that actually landed. Mac ended being imprisoned because of the strained relationship between them and Ray. And because of, when you look at contracts, corporate governance encourages people to deal with their counterparties to the contract in a fair way. That's one. And as well as with transparency. So that now led to Ray buying out the Macdonald's brothers and actually even removing the brand or the Macdonald's brand from their shop. So now that's the Macdonald's brothers, and you can see that because there were no proper corporate governance in that relationship, then it caused strain and the breakup between Ray and the Macdonald's brothers. Now, going into looking at how Ray conducted the business after the Macdonald's brothers, after the contract with Macdonald's brothers, or after he bought out the Macdonald's brothers, he managed to set up a proper governance structure, because he had June, who was more looking at the administration side, and he had Harry, who was looking at the finance side, and he was looking at the operation side. So from there on, they seem to have had implemented a proper structure in a way that there were segregation of duties, there were, in terms of responsibilities, were allocated accordingly. And if you read the book of Macdonald's, you can see Ray as well was more responsible in a way that he was investing in charity, he was doing his community duties. So on the responsibility side, it seems like Macdonald's brothers implemented, not the brothers, but the Macdonald's as a brand implemented proper corporate governance and corporate responsibility programs to make sure that they contribute towards the community and give back to charity and all that. So with corporate governance, it's not only about putting controls in place or managing the risk, it also has the softer side of things where you need to make sure that you act as a responsible citizen as a corporate. So from there you can see that the Macdonald had from the beginning had a good corporate governance in place. And as I mentioned earlier, that now because they are a listed institution, you can go and look at their financial reporting. It will show that they have a portion where they are reporting on compliance and on corporate governance issues, and they have independent directors, because as a company you need to have the split between the CEO or the MD or the executive director and the chairperson. The chairperson needs to be an independent person, so that there's a separation of duties between the chairperson and the CEO. So currently, if you look at the structure at Macdonald, it's fully compliant with recommended principles or recommended characters of corporate governance. So from the Macdonald's case study, it shows that it's a model citizen. It complies with different risks, different accountability. They are accountable. They are doing the things the way they're supposed to be done. So that is a little bit different when it comes to AUI, as we've gone through that. They didn't have any structures in place. They didn't assess their risks. They just took their risk tolerance was a little bit higher than it should. And you can see where the two organizations ended up, was the AUI, they ended in prison, and while the McDonald's ended up being a successful venture. It's not like it's because of the corporate governance, but those things contribute towards the success of an organization. So if you don't set up proper governance structures, that will impact on the performance of your business. So as an entrepreneur, yes, initially you might be a one-man show where you don't have structures in place. But slowly, as you develop, you need to make sure that you have policies in place where it allows or it creates a culture of corporate governance. And sometimes you're just doing deals because we have to do deals. Those can land you in trouble, as we've seen with AUI. So as an entrepreneur, make sure that you initially, as you start, you put structures in place. You make sure that your organization is, one, in terms of communication, is transparent. And if you have shareholders, you need to present accurate information when you put into them. Because if you look at the AUI story, Ephraim was not presenting accurate information to Ralph, who was the investor at the time. So Ralph thought he was getting 30% of profit share, only to find out later on when Ephraim was fighting with David, that he was only getting 15% of the profit share. So now transparency becomes very, very important when you are dealing with shareholders. If you have directors and shareholders, so the communication between the directors, and which directors are operationally involved, and shareholders, not all the time, but with small businesses, most of the time, shareholders are directly involved in the business. But if you get to a point where you have a shareholder who's not part of the business, you need to make sure that the communication between the company and its shareholders is transparent. And if there are any actions that needs to be taken, the directors are accountable. So they need to account for each and everything that's going on in the business. Unlike the shareholders who are outside. So the shareholders there's that agency agreement where the shareholders give instruction to the directors to perform certain duties. So if something goes wrong, or operationally maybe the company gets sued or something goes wrong, the directors are the one who's supposed to be responsible, or who's supposed to be accountable to whatever that's going on within the business. So with corporate governance, it's just trying to make sure that organizations do business in a fair way, in a transparent way, in an honest way, so that you can build trust between the shareholders and the directors, and build good relationship with all other stakeholders. Okay, so that's the case study on Macdonald's. Now we're going to discuss the case study on the Oakland A's. With the Oakland A's, it appears to be an organization that is well run, because you can see when Billy was looking for funding to buy new players, he had to go to Steve, the owner, to get permission or to get an approval to buy certain things, to buy the players. So with that, you can see already there are controls in place. the separation of duties between an executive and the shareholder. So the Billy and Steve relationship, that's where you can see clearly there are separation of duties, which is what corporate governance encourages, to say there must be separation of duties between ownership and operational executive. So Billy, as an executive, to do certain things, he needed an approval from the shareholder. So with Billy, you can see even with communication, he was transparent when he was communicating with Steve to say, I need 1, 2, 3, 4. And then even during the movie, you can see he was giving regular feedback to Steve. If he was buying players, when he needs approval, he would approach Steve to say, I need approval for this, I'm doing this. So in terms of the relationship between the shareholder, in this case being Steve, and Billy, there was a good relationship, and they managed to maintain that relationship. And that is proven by the fact that even Steve, when the season ended, he retained Billy as the manager, and Billy had an opportunity to move to the Red Sox. They offered him a lot of money because of the good relationship and good governance that him and Steve had built. He didn't move to the Red Sox because he wanted to be successful with the Oakland A's. So if you maintain good corporate governance within your organization, that now nurtures the relationship between, one, the directors and the shareholders, and two, as well as the relationship between all the stakeholders involved, like your players and all that. So it creates a very conducive environment to operate. So as a small business or a growing business, you should make sure that you maintain that relationship. You make sure that you maintain those principles, the principles of corporate governance. And I should mention that they're not like a difficult principles. I mean, you need to be accountable, you need to be responsible, you need to be honest, you need to be transparent in the things that you do. And then you also, one key thing maybe with the Oakland A's, maybe the Billy's risk tolerance was a little bit higher than an average executive will have, because the strategy that he implemented was, call it radical, where he changed the system completely to go with a different model. Yes, it has worked out for him. They had a very successful season, but it could have created a negative result if they didn't win the way they did, because what he did, it was something that was never done before. But one important thing is he was transparent about what he was doing, and he was accountable for the result. He took responsibility. When the team is not performing, he didn't blame anyone. He took responsibility to say that it is his fault. He knows what he's there for, to deliver the championship. And if the team is not performing, him and Pete will take responsibility, but mainly he was the one who's taking the responsibility. And you can see even the commentators where, when they started winning, they were saying the coach is the one who's doing a good job. And Pete was unhappy with that. But Billy was comfortable. He didn't want to take credit for it. He was fine if other people took credit for the performance, but he was willing to take the blame for non-performance. When the team was not performing, he was willing to be the one who's taking responsibility. Because he was saying that Pete was also worried to say, what will people say if you do these changes? And Billy said, look, I'm a 45-year-old man. I don't even have the degree. So I'm the one who's supposed to be worried. But I'm not worried because I believe in this project. So it shows that when he was implementing the new strategy, he was willing to take the consequences with the wins. And then if he had lost, then he might have lost his job. But as an executive, he was willing to do that. And that is what corporate governance encourages entrepreneurs or business leaders to do, to take responsibility for their action. You'd have noticed, if you know, like when with the Enrons, with call it VBS and those corporate failures, the executives always have someone else to blame. they never took responsibility for it, and which is what the corporate governance is trying to discourage. But if you look at the Oakland A, the way they've managed the business, you can see that they had very good corporate governance in place. So I hope you as entrepreneurs, you learn from how the Oakland A's manage their operation, and there are a few things that you can learn from the Macdonald's case study. And for AY, you need to know that though it's not how you're supposed to run the business. What you can learn from that case study is that you shouldn't do what they did. You should approach it differently, because you can see even the consequences. Ultimately, they failed. And these two institutions, like your Macdonald's and the Oakland A's, were successful because, okay, not only because they implemented a good corporate governance, but that contributes towards performance. Because if you have good corporate governance, the environment is just conducive for you to perform. And you know that if you have good structures in place, you are unlikely to be sued later on, because you'll be doing things according to the book. And then unlike not implementing proper corporate governance structures like AUI did, and you can see where they ended up in prison. So that's the difference between organizations that implement good corporate governance and those don't. But I'm not saying corporate governance is the ultimate decider of whether the business is successful or not, but it is a major contributing strategy. You need to make sure that you implement that good corporate governance to give you a chance to build a sustainable organization. I thank you. That's the end of the lesson today.